I wanted to thank everybody who came today, and I wanted to thank the organizers of this very interesting conference. Osmani is not here, but one of the things that's been very nice is just how plural the conversations have been. I was just at a lunch table discussion where we were saying we're not exactly policy diffusion scholars, but we appreciate being part of the conversation and bringing some of these issues to bear. So I'm going to follow up a little bit on the conversations we had yesterday. And I prepared this this morning because of a conversation that I was having with Jenny yesterday. And so today I'm mostly going to talk about, my reference is going to be New York City. And I'm going to take the privilege I have as a person who has studied and written about participatory budgeting and social movements in Brazil for some time to say something a little bit against our common sense around these things. And this is the question of why social movements sometimes oppose participatory democracy. So, so I'm going to take you to New York City, where I work. And New York City elected the United States' most progressive mayor in 2013 on agenda to fight the tale of two cities. He was against that. He was promoting a language of inclusivity. He was talking about affordable housing. We had had a very pro-business mayor before, Mayor de Blasio, and he came in on a wave of opposition politics. And Mayor de Blasio talked a lot about participation in putting citizens, in putting people at the center of his administration. So a few days after he was elected, there was this initiative called Talking Transition. Talking Transition was funded by the Open Society. And it had this very lofty goal, which was politics as usual in New York takes place behind closed doors. And now with this new mayor, although Open Society doesn't name the mayor, with this new administration, we're going to do things differently. We're going to do things out in the open. It's going to be deliberative. It's going to be participatory. We're going to bring in the people of New York to talk about the issues that really matter. And we're going to put politicians in the place where they belong, which is serving the people. And we're going to no longer have politics as they used to be. And it's funny to me because this sounded kind of familiar. I was like, I feel like I've heard this story before. I feel like this language of putting people in the center and changing politics and sounds a little bit like my time in Porto Alegre back in the day. So I started to go to Talking Transition. So this is what it looked like. So in the downtown area of New York, they put up this beautiful transparent building. I don't know if you can see, but it's actually all glass. And the idea is, it was beautiful sunny winter days, but the idea was that this was supposed to signal the transparency of governance that was going to be taking place. And there were lots and lots of things you could do. So you could talk about the things that mattered to you and just put it in a little box for the incoming mayor. There were lots of round tables. There was a van. There were actually two vans going around New York City with an iPad capable of understanding your opinion in at least 10 different languages. So you could speak Bengali or Arabic or Portuguese or Spanish and really say what mattered to you as a citizen or as a resident of New York City. This is another one. There were special seminars on education, public safety, health and social services, jobs and economy, anything that mattered to you. In fact, there was even a special exercise on participatory budgeting. And so one of the things that happened on the days before the event, there was discussion about what would be a proper participatory layout of the tables, how do we bring people into participatory budgeting. As Tarso knows, New York City had been doing participatory budgeting since the year before Bill de Blasio came into office, and he was promising upon arrival that he was going to make it even better and more participatory. So if we move forward. So then we have this kind of interesting question. Why why is it that social movements could be against these things, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about what happened with talking transition, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other participatory exercises. For much of my research career, one of the things that I looked at, so for example, I have a book with Marcelo Silva and Patrick Heller, where we looked at PT administrations in the early 2000s and the kinds of participatory exercises they had. And we came to a conclusion then that social movements were very, very important in making sure that the participatory budgets that they had were meaningful, were over large parts of the budget, that they were binding. So up on much of that research, social movements played the kind of role we would expect them to. So the administration comes in with a promise of openness. Strong social movements guarantees that it actually does that, and it is something meaningful. However, something else that had been at the periphery of my consciousness over these past few years has been that sometimes in social movements and organized sectors very actively oppose participatory democracy exercises. My friend Ernesto Ganuz and I write about the city of Cordoba, which was the first city in Europe to adopt participatory budgeting, and the very strong opposition that the neighborhood associations had to the participatory budgeting process there, and in fact, able to derail it entirely. And once you look a little bit behind carefully at the descriptions, there often are these moments where social movements line up in a way that you would not expect, right? So why would that be? So my intervention today is a provocation to ask that question, and I'm going to propose a couple of reasons why. And this is again an idea of Ernesto's and I. We talk about empowerment within limits as a characteristic mode of citizen participation today. Many times in the talks yesterday, and in many papers these days, people do talk about this participation fever, this real focus on citizen-centered governance that has been really dominant or near dominant in policy circles in the EU, in North America, in development agencies. Brazil is the most participatory country that there ever was, probably, right? So there's been a lot of this. But we coined this phrase to talk about empowerment within limits as a way to talk about the way that the language of empowerment, it's supposed to be a kind of contradictory phrase. Empowerment really should have no limits. But this is empowerment, but within limits. So we talk about the kind of three sorts of ambiguous or contradictory features of these participatory forums, and this is not limited to participatory budgeting at all. One is the emphasis on deliberation. So I too think deliberation is an interesting idea. I've advocated for deliberation. I think it's important for us to think about how it works, when it doesn't work. But sometimes the flip side of deliberation, or the flip side on having very strong rules about what constitutes proper behavior in a meeting, is that some kinds of ideas and modes of speech and modes of engagement are considered not proper, right? So all the time, if you think about it, people are making arguments that are not allowed in the room or in the table because they do not fall within the idea of deliberation. They're not civil. They're not polite. And one of the things we worry about that is that deliberation sneaks with it, can sneak in with it a kind of limit on what's possible. Second, and this is one that's very present in the de Blasio open transition, and in very present in the United States today in participatory exercises, people love to talk about regular citizens. Say we love to have, and this is, by the way, an idea that very directly has connections to Porto Alegre in a way. we love to have regular people. We don't want experts. So that's democratizing. It's positive for us to ask who is speaking. But what this can mean sometimes is this is a cover for non-associational or non-collective representation. In other words, when we have regular citizens, we have individuals, we don't have unions. When we have regular citizens, we don't have representatives of social movements. When we have regular citizens, and there's a phrase they use in the United States all the time, the usual suspects. Who is the usual suspect? Is a person who goes to meeting after meeting after meeting who's just a pain, but who knows a lot. We don't want that person. And this is dangerous, right? We worry about what happens when you don't have the associational representation. And from a democratic theory point of view, lest you think I'm wanting to argue something anti-democratic, we value social movements because precisely they are not everybody and they're not regular citizens. We value them because they're specific and they're saying something that just talking to regular citizens won't bring. So we worry about the regular citizens. And then we worry a lot about the way that the common or the commons or the public good is defined in some of these experiments. So this idea of talking as equals about common problems belongs to social movements, right? It was the motivating kind of logic at the World Social Forum. It has been the motivating logic for many, many social movements. But when administrations come and start talking about the public good, desculpa. I'm late to a meeting in New York. When we talk about the common good, we worry about the definition of the common good that comes with it. Whose common good? Who gets to speak for it? And what are the limits? So we worry, as useful as it is to talk about the thing that belongs to us and that we're all going to talk about, we worry about the limits that come with it. So these are the kind of the three sorts of rhetorical moves or the coordinates of participation today that we feel can be democratizing, but has a kind of ambiguous flip side sometimes. So, how am I on time? Okay, good. Let me tell you a little bit how participation has unfolded in the de Blasio administration. Let's see. Yeah, so let me skip over to the Bronx. So, and if you have a minute, we'll show a little bit of each of these links because they're interesting. So one of the things that our mayor in New York has done is an aggressive upzoning program, which is there are parts of the city, he targeted 11 poor and minority neighborhoods for upzoning, meaning able to build luxury housing, increase the density sometimes, and move them away from the regulated housing that it has. So many community advocates feel that upzoning is actually a cover for gentrification and displacement. And one of the things that the mayoral discourse has been about is, no, we're actually going to do inclusive participatory meetings to have our vision about the zoning and what kind of upzoning we want. And I'm going to show you two videos very quickly. Dá para clicar no primeiro? We'll just watch. Bom, I will send this around so you can see, but I'll try to describe as best I can. If you go back to the previous one, then to the. So if you go to this first one, the East Harlem plan, it has a very slick website about how the administration is listening to community members, it's forming community groups to discuss the upzoning. What community advocates will tell you, there's a beautiful expression in Portuguese that I know from my time in research field. Eles chegam com prato feito. They arrive with the plate already set. In other words, there's plenty of discussion exercises and cartoonists drawing things and people moving around the room, but it's going to be upzoning anyway. And it's going to be the same measures. One of the disputes, there's a technical fight between community advocates and administration about what constitutes affordable housing. And the administration uses a very inflated measure from our point of view. So anyways, this first video shows that, and then there is a kind of beautiful exercise in people doing planning and drawing and this kind of stuff. The second one is a Spanish language video by a community group that talks about an alternate planning exercise they're doing alongside anyway that has nothing to do with the upzoning, where they decide they don't want upzoning, and then it has some documentary footage of them wanting to participate in the hearing exercise. And it's wonderful because you hear someone say, oh, no, 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 this is not for social movements, this is for regular people. They come in anyway, and they make a huge, loud set of noises about it, right? And even though the participatory process itself was wonderful, even though the participatory process itself did tick all the boxes of a good process, except for this fundamental one, which is what is really being decided here? And in fact, very little was being decided, nothing was being decided, and it was done, community activists feel, as a way to limit the discourse and to put some legitimacy on top, right? We're going to do these policies anyway, we've done a hearing. So for me, this is the provocation that we need to think in a kind of nuanced way when we assume what social movements are, that they always want participatory democracy. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from Porto Alegre, from the real deal place. Okay, so this is a meeting of the fabled participatory budgeting, 1998, I think. And this is a picture of how I have, and many others, I suppose, have gone about our research, which is there's a meeting, there's a process, we're going to go to the meetings. I was sitting here taking notes, there was an agenda, we were talking about stuff, but if you open the next one, we weren't always looking at the margins of the process. So if you look a little closer, these people were talking, these people were talking. Turns out that they were actually very upset at what was happening in the process, and these two gentlemen who are at the edge of the picture, they get into almost a physical fight about 3 minutes after I took this picture. But if you go back to one more. This is normally what we look at. We take administrators' words for granted because I think we like them and because they are like us and they have PhDs in sociology. But we take them at their word, but if you go back, there's a lot of things that we miss, right? And I think now the moment where we are, we have to do a kind of self-criticism about why did all this participation not prevent the political outcomes that we've had? Why didn't it solidify our projects more? I think one of the things we have to do is think about the things that escaped our point of view in the first place. Okay? Obrigado. Thank you.
I have a question for Gianpaolo, and I would like to ask him if, in his experience in seeing this kind of spaces for participation for citizens, if he has seen places, spaces, cities, or countries where the dish was not already served. Because I work on China, and I actually had a lot of fun when you say that the de Blasio came out with the concept of the citizen at the center of policy, because it's now a big slogan in China, Union way better. And they're introducing spaces for participation too, but everything, of course, in China, you can imagine, is already set. But I did a comparative, I studied a little bit how it is done in other countries, looking at the literature, and in France, in the programs of urban renewal, everything was already set since the beginning, and so even if they had citizen participation as a principle by the central state for the realization of these programs, basically there was no citizen participation because the urban renewal, which meant demolition of entire quarters, was never renegotiated. The same for the New Deal of Communities, as I read an article by a British scholar saying the same for the programs in Germany. So I wonder whether you have seen spaces where the dish was not already served and that there was really space to renegotiate and rediscuss the objectives of planning.
In groups, yeah, we have another one.
Yes, I'd like to address a question to Gianpaolo about the regular citizen, because we have the same questions here, the same issues here in São Paulo. And I'd like to listen a little bit more about the methodologies that you use. So, thank you. I'd like to listen a little bit more about the methodologies that they have used in New York to give voice to the regular citizen, because you need a different format, a different methodology, a different procedures to give the opportunities to the regular citizen to address their issues, address their questions. How they work, how they work with this.
Hi, good afternoon. My question's for Gianpaolo. I don't know if you heard about the São Paulo situation in the last mandate, Fernando Haddad's administration. So we had a participatory council, municipal council, and I would like to know from you, because we also had some thematic councils directed to specific vulnerable groups, for example, women's participatory council, or for example, in municipal participatory council, we had a special seat for migrants. So what do you think about this separation through the themes, and if it works in your opinion, and if it had something like this in New York City, I don't know, or any experience related to that, and if you think it's efficient or not to have some specific participatory tables according to the vulnerable group. So that's.
I'll quickly just quickly answer the questions on participation, and then I'll turn it to my fellow panelists. We can talk about the diffusion. I can say about that too. So this idea that Ernesto and I have is that when we look at, we think that the ladder of participation framework that people use is not necessarily as useful as for what we do in our work is we separate a kind of communication, inclusion dimension, and a sovereignty dimension. In other words, we can ask two questions. Who's included and how is it participatory? Are the vulnerable population represented? Do people speak the same amount? Who runs the meetings? And then we also ask, how much power is there behind this, right? How much decision-making power over significant decisions that the community was interested in, a priori, right? So we think these two things are one of the things that has happened in the global diffusion, that these things got a bit separate. So the inclusion methodologies or the discursive methodologies have traveled, and there is, some of these methodologies are very successful. So New York City is a segregated city, and it's not a small accomplishment to get people in a room to talk as equals about common things. And some of the methodologies they use are effective. So for example, they do have separate meetings in Spanish and in Bengali, and they work very hard using also Brazilian popular education technologies and techniques to incorporate people. They're another thing that they do that's very useful is they're attentive to when meetings take place. So if it's taking place in the evening, who's going to do the child care, those kinds of questions. They're good also making sure meetings don't run forever. This is a key thing for regular people not to run. If the meeting is going to be 4 hours, you know who's going to win, is the person who has 4 hours to spend and maybe is retired, maybe doesn't have child care. So some of those things are interesting. I would say, from the outside, the conselhos participativos and the methodologies they have had under Haddad seem very impressive. I don't have much more to say. I think the idea of talking to vulnerable populations in particular settings and in methodology that are appropriate, I think is very good. But the question we always return to, even with Haddad, even with administrations that are politically aligned to our principles, is, are really we making decisions over the big questions? You know, is zoning, is the gentrification in Cracolândia, is that up to discussion? You know, one of the things, to get back to Angela's paper, Brazil has had more national participatory councils than any country probably, but there's not one council you could go to during Lula or Dilma where you could decide the price of the bus fare or decide on a national subsidy for free transportation. Some things is always off the table. Now, the places where I've seen that some things were on the table. So for sure, some PT administrations in the 90s and 2000s did that. So Belo Horizonte, Recife, Porto Alegre. Outside of Brazil, I've seen very interesting things happening in Barcelona. Currently, the Barcelona and Camus process, the process in Madrid seems to be very robust. Seems to be real decision-making at stake. And then, interestingly, in Iceland, after they had the pots and pans revolution and they reformed the constitution to include participatory mechanisms, many of those are real, and many of the decisions they have taken have been against very powerful interests, for example, international banking. So we can turn to the diffusion so I don't take up all the time.